The carriage wheels crunch against frozen gravel, each revolution grinding ice crystals into powder beneath Margaret Whitmore's feet as she steps down into the brutal Ohio winter. Her breath forms ghostly clouds that dissipate into the gray December sky, and the cold bites through her wool coat like hungry teeth. Before her stands the Penrose Orphanage, a Gothic monument of blackened stone that seems to devour the weak sunlight filtering through the bare oak branches overhead. Margaret pulls her traveling case from the carriage floor, her gloved fingers already numb despite the thick leather. The driver, a weathered man named Cole, refuses to meet her eyes as he hands down her trunk. "This is as far as I go, miss," he mutters, his voice barely audible above the wind that howls through the orphanage's broken shutters. "You sure about this place?" "I'm expected," Margaret replies, though uncertainty creeps into her voice as she studies the building's towering spires and crow-blackened eaves. The orphanage looms against the winter sky like a cathedral built for mourning, its windows dark as dead eyes. Cole shakes his head and climbs back onto his wagon bench. "God help you then." The horse's hooves strike the frozen ground with urgent rhythm as the carriage disappears down the winding road, leaving Margaret alone with the wind and the oppressive silence that seems to emanate from the orphanage itself. She approaches the massive oak doors, each one carved with cherubic faces that time and weather have twisted into grimacing masks. The iron knocker hangs heavy in her hand, cold enough to burn through her gloves. 3 sharp raps echo through the structure, and Margaret waits, listening to the sound bounce off stone walls and fade into darkness. The door opens without a sound, revealing a grand hall that stretches into shadow. 13 children stand in perfect formation across the black and white checkered floor, their pale faces turned toward her with expressions of ancient patience. Not one of them moves. Not one of them blinks. "Welcome to Penrose Orphanage," says the smallest child, a girl who cannot be more than 8 years old. Her voice carries the weight of winter itself, each word dropping like ice into still water. "I am Patience." Margaret steps across the threshold, and the temperature drops another 10 degrees. The children remain motionless, their eyes following her movement with predatory focus. She counts them again, 13 pale faces, 13 sets of eyes that reflect light like polished stones in a crypt. "I'm Margaret Whitmore," she manages, her voice smaller than she intended. "The new matron." "We know who you are," Patience replies, and the other children nod in unison, a choreographed movement that makes Margaret's skin crawl. "We've been waiting." The grand hall stretches before her, its vaulted ceiling disappearing into shadow 20 feet above. Portraits line the walls, dozens of stern-faced men and women in outdated clothing, their painted eyes seeming to track Margaret's movement through the room. At the far end, a massive staircase curves upward like a serpent's spine, its banister carved from wood so dark it appears to absorb light. "Where are the other staff?" Margaret asks, setting down her case and removing her coat. The children watch this simple action with the intensity of scientists observing a fascinating specimen. "There are no others," says a boy of perhaps 9, his voice pitched too low for his age. "Only us. Only you now." Margaret's predecessor had left suddenly, according to the letter from the orphanage board. No explanation, no notice, simply gone one morning, leaving behind only a hastily scrawled note that the board had shared with Margaret: "The children are not what they seem." She had assumed it was the ramblings of someone overwhelmed by the responsibility of caring for so many troubled youths. Looking at their faces now, she begins to understand why someone might flee. "Perhaps you could show me to my quarters," Margaret says, attempting to inject authority into her voice. "I'd like to settle in before we discuss the daily routine." Patience tilts her head, the gesture birdlike and unsettling. "Of course, Miss Whitmore. But first, wouldn't you like to meet everyone properly?" Without waiting for an answer, Patience begins walking down the line of children, her small hand resting briefly on each shoulder as she speaks. "This is Temperance, age 9. Constance, also 9. Prudence, 8 years and 11 months. Each child nods as their name is called, their movements synchronized and mechanical. Margaret notices the pattern immediately. Not one child appears older than 9, and most seem to hover at the edge of that age, as if time itself had paused just before some crucial threshold. "How long have they all been here?" she asks. "Oh, a very long time," Patience replies, completing her circuit and returning to stand before Margaret. "Some longer than others. We don't often speak of time here. It moves, differently. The wind howls against the windows, rattling panes of glass so old they've turned purple with age." Margaret shivers, though she's not certain if it's from cold or from something else entirely, something that crawls along her spine like fingers made of ice. "The board mentioned that the orphanage has had some difficulties," Margaret says carefully. "Health issues among the children?" The 13 faces turn toward her in perfect unison, and for a moment, Margaret sees something flicker behind their eyes, not childish innocence, but something ancient and hungry. The expression passes so quickly she almost convinces herself she imagined it. "We are very healthy," says Temperance, the girl Patience had introduced first. "We never grow sick. We never grow weak. We never grow old," adds Constance, and several of the other children nod in agreement. Margaret's throat feels suddenly dry. "What happened to the children who were here before you?" Patience's smile widens, revealing teeth that seem too sharp for a child her age. "They graduated, Miss Whitmore. On their 10th birthday, they all graduated." The silence that follows stretches like a held breath. Margaret becomes aware of other sounds, the settling of old wood, the scratch of bare branches against windows, and something else. Something that might be breathing, though she cannot identify its source. "I should like to see my room now," Margaret says, her voice barely above a whisper. Patience claps her hands together, the sound sharp as a gunshot in the vaulted hall. "Of course. Temperance will show you to the matron's quarters. Dinner is at 6 o'clock precisely. We do hope you'll join us." Temperance steps forward, her movements graceful as a dancer's. "This way, Miss Whitmore." As Margaret follows the girl up the massive staircase, she feels the weight of 12 sets of eyes watching her ascent. The portraits on the walls seem to lean forward in their frames, their painted faces twisted with expressions of warning or perhaps hunger, Margaret cannot tell which. At the top of the stairs, Temperance leads her down a corridor lined with doors, each one identical except for the brass numbers that mark them. "Your room is at the end," Temperance says. "It has the best view of the grounds." The matron's quarters are larger than Margaret expected, furnished with heavy oak pieces that belong to an earlier century. A fire crackles in the stone hearth, casting dancing shadows across walls lined with books and medical texts. Through the tall windows, Margaret can see the orphanage grounds stretching toward a line of leafless trees that mark the property's boundary. "It's lovely," Margaret says, though the word feels wrong in her mouth. "Nothing about this place is lovely, it's beautiful in the way that graveyards are beautiful, with a cold perfection that speaks of endings rather than beginnings." Temperance curtsies, another gesture that seems far too adult for her years. "We're so pleased you've come, Miss Whitmore. The previous matron left us quite suddenly. We do hope you'll stay longer." Before Margaret can respond, the girl turns and glides from the room, closing the door behind her with barely a sound. Margaret finds herself alone with the crackling fire and the growing certainty that she has made a terrible mistake. Outside her window, the December wind carries what sounds like children's laughter, though when she looks down at the courtyard below, she sees nothing but snow and shadow. Have you ever walked into a place that felt immediately wrong, like the walls themselves were watching you? What would you do? Margaret awakens to silence so complete it presses against her eardrums like water. No birds sing outside her window. No wind rattles the glass. Even the fire in her hearth has died to cold ash, though she distinctly remembers banking the coals before sleep. The winter sun struggles through frost-covered panes, casting pale light across her unfamiliar room. She dresses quickly, her breath visible in the sudden chill, and ventures into the corridor. The orphanage feels different in daylight, not less threatening, but more revealing, like a corpse with its shroud pulled back. The floorboards creak beneath her feet with sounds that echo through the building's bones. The children are nowhere to be seen. Margaret makes her way to what she assumes must be the headmaster's office, a room she'd glimpsed the evening before during Patience's brief tour. The door stands slightly ajar, and she pushes it open to reveal a study lined with dark wood and filled with the musty scent of old paper and something else, something organic and unpleasant that she cannot identify. Behind the massive desk, built-in shelves hold dozens of leather-bound ledgers, each spine marked with careful dates spanning the past 20 years. Margaret pulls down the most recent volume, dated 1847, and opens it to pages filled with meticulous handwriting. Each entry follows the same format: a child's name, age upon arrival, and date of graduation. Margaret's hands begin to tremble as she reads through page after page of records. Every single child who had lived at the Penrose Orphanage in the past 2 decades had died, the euphemistic graduation always occurring on the child's 9th birthday, never a day before or after. Sarah Millicent Hayes. Age upon arrival, 6 years, 3 months. Graduated December 12, 1845, age 9 years exactly. Cause of graduation, fever and delirium. Thomas Edward Crane. Age upon arrival, 7 years, 2 months. Graduated March 3, 1846, age 9 years exactly. Cause of graduation, consumption and speaking in unknown tongues. Margaret flips through more pages, finding the same pattern repeated endlessly. The descriptions grow more disturbing as she reads: children speaking dead languages, developing insatiable appetites for raw meat, experiencing violent seizures that required multiple adults to restrain them. Always on their 9th birthday. Always fatal. Her search becomes frantic, ledger after ledger revealing the same horrible truth. Not a single child in 20 years had lived to see their 10th birthday. The current 13 residents, Patience, Temperance, Constance, and the others, would all be approaching that fatal threshold within months. Looking for something, Miss Whitmore? Margaret spins around to find Patience standing in the doorway, her pale face expressionless. The child moves with that same unnatural grace, entering the study without invitation and closing the door behind her. I was trying to understand the orphanage's history, Margaret says, attempting to keep her voice steady. These records are troubling. Patience approaches the desk, her small hands tracing the leather binding of the open ledger. Troubling is such an interesting word choice. We prefer to think of it as tradition. Children dying isn't tradition, Patience. It's tragedy. The girl's laugh sounds like breaking glass. Oh, Miss Whitmore, you misunderstand so much. We don't die. We transform. Margaret clutches the ledger against her chest, as if the weight of the book might anchor her to sanity. What are you talking about? Would you like to see where we keep the real records? Patience asks, her voice taking on a sing-song quality that makes Margaret's teeth ache. The ones that tell the truth about what happens here. Before Margaret can answer, Patience kneels beside the desk and presses something hidden beneath its edge. A section of the floor slides away with a grinding sound, revealing a narrow staircase that descends into absolute darkness. The previous matrons never found this, Patience says proudly. They were never curious enough. Never brave enough. But you're different, aren't you, Miss Whitmore? Margaret stares into the black opening, every instinct screaming at her to flee. Instead, she finds herself asking, what's down there? The truth, Patience replies. About the orphanage. About us. About what's going to happen to you. The temperature in the room drops another 10 degrees, and Margaret's breath comes in sharp puffs. She realizes that Patience isn't breathing at all, no vapor escapes the child's lips, no rise and fall disturbs her chest. "You're not breathing," Margaret whispers. Patience tilts her head, considering this observation. "We don't need to breathe, Miss Whitmore. We don't need to eat regular food or sleep or do any of the things living children do. We only need one thing." "What?" "Love," Patience says, and her smile reveals teeth that have grown longer and sharper since yesterday. "The kind of love that caretakers give to children. The kind that makes their blood taste sweeter when we finally feed." Margaret backs toward the door, but it has somehow closed and locked behind her. The click of the mechanism echoes through the study like bones snapping. "Don't be frightened," Patience coos, advancing with predatory patience. "We're not going to hurt you yet. It wouldn't taste right if we didn't let you care for us first. That's why the previous matrons always stayed for months before their graduation." The floor beneath the secret stairs begins to glow with a sickly phosphorescent light, and Margaret can see rough stone steps leading down into what appears to be a natural cave system. The air rising from below carries the stench of decay and something else, something that makes her gorge rise in her throat. "The children you read about in those ledgers," Patience continues, "they're all still here, Miss Whitmore. Would you like to meet them?" From the darkness below comes the sound of movement, shuffling footsteps and wet, dragging sounds that speak of things that should not move but do. Margaret presses herself against the locked door, her hands scrabbling uselessly at the handle. "The first matron built this place for us," Patience explains, her voice never losing its childlike sweetness despite the horror of her words. "Well, not her exactly. The man who told her to build it. The preacher who made us what we are." Shapes begin to emerge from the phosphorescent glow, small figures that might once have been children, now twisted into something else entirely. Their movements are wrong, joints bending in directions that anatomy shouldn't allow, and their faces. Margaret forces herself to look away before her mind can fully process what she's seeing. "We were the first," Patience says, gesturing toward the approaching forms. "The preacher's experiment. He thought he could make us into angels, but he was wrong about what kind of angels we'd become." The door behind Margaret suddenly swings open, and she tumbles backward into the corridor. Without looking to see what might be following, she runs toward the main staircase, her feet slipping on the polished wood floors. Behind her, she hears Patience's laughter echoing through the building, joined by other voices, dozens of them, all childlike and terrible. Margaret reaches her room and slams the door, dragging the heavy oak dresser across the entrance. Outside, the laughter continues, growing louder and more numerous, until it seems to come from the walls themselves. She presses her face to the window, desperately searching the frozen landscape for any sign of help, any possibility of escape. But the orphanage sits alone in its circle of dead trees, miles from the nearest town, and the road that brought her here stretches empty toward the horizon. As evening approaches, the laughter fades to whispers, and Margaret hears Patience's voice calling sweetly through the door, "Dinner is ready, Miss Whitmore. We're all waiting for you." Margaret remains barricaded in her room until hunger forces her to venture out. The corridor lies empty in the fading afternoon light, but she can hear sounds from below, the clink of dishes, the scrape of chairs, and underneath it all, a wet tearing noise that makes her stomach clench with dread. She descends the main staircase on silent feet, following the sounds to a dining hall she hadn't seen during her arrival. The room stretches long and narrow, dominated by a table that could seat 30. 13 places are set with gleaming silver and bone-white china, and 13 children sit in perfect posture, their pale hands folded in their laps. "Miss Whitmore." Patience calls cheerfully from her seat at the head of the table. "We saved you a place." Margaret enters the room slowly, her eyes adjusting to the candlelight that flickers from a massive chandelier overhead. The children smile at her with expressions of angelic innocence, but she notices that their teeth catch the light strangely, seeming longer and sharper than they had the day before. "Please, sit," says Temperance, gesturing to the empty chair beside her. "We're about to begin evening grace." Margaret takes her seat, her hands trembling as she unfolds the linen napkin and places it across her lap. The plate before her holds what appears to be roasted meat, still red at the center, accompanied by root vegetables that glisten with grease. The smell rises from the plate in waves, rich, metallic, and somehow wrong. "Shall we pray?" Patience asks, and 13 small heads bow in unison. "For what we are about to receive," they chant in perfect synchronization, "we give eternal thanks. May it nourish our bodies and feed our souls. May it sustain us until the next harvest comes." Margaret keeps her head bowed, but her eyes remain open, watching the children through her lashes. Their lips move with the practiced ease of a prayer repeated countless times, but the words seem to hang in the air with unnatural weight, as if the very atmosphere resists their utterance. "Amen," the children conclude, and immediately begin eating with startling efficiency. Margaret watches in growing horror as 13 sets of small hands tear into the bloody meat with more enthusiasm than utensils. They maintain perfect posture and dining etiquette, but their movements possess an animalistic urgency that transforms the civilized meal into something primitive and disturbing. "Aren't you hungry, Miss Whitmore?" asks Constance, a girl Margaret guesses to be 8 years old. Blood stains the child's lips and chin, but her voice remains sweet and concerned. "Cook prepared this especially for your first dinner with us." What kind of meat is this?" Margaret manages to ask. Patience pauses in her eating, a piece of flesh hanging from her fork. "Does it matter? Meat is meat. Flesh is flesh. What we consume becomes part of us, just as we become part of what consumes us." The other children giggle at this statement, the sound high and musical but somehow predatory. Margaret realizes that not one of them has touched the vegetables on their plates, only the raw, bloody meat commands their attention. "I'm not very hungry," Margaret says, pushing her plate away. "Perhaps I could just have some bread." "There is no bread in this house," says Prudence, another girl whose age Margaret cannot quite determine. "We don't eat the food of the living. We haven't for a very long time." Margaret's throat constricts. "The food of the living?" Temperance nods enthusiastically, as if discussing a favorite game. "Living food doesn't satisfy us anymore. It passes through us like water through a sieve. We need something with more substance." "More life," adds Constance. "More fear," says Prudence. "More love," finishes Patience, and her smile reveals teeth that are definitely longer than they had been that morning. Margaret stands abruptly, her chair scraping against the stone floor. "I think I should return to my room." "But you haven't eaten anything," Patience protests, rising gracefully from her seat. "How can we be sure you're healthy if you don't eat? How can we be sure you'll last long enough to properly care for us?" The other children begin to stand as well, moving with that same synchronized precision that Margaret has noticed before. They form a loose circle around her, not threatening exactly, but positioned to prevent easy escape. "We had such hopes for you, Miss Whitmore," Temperance says sadly. "The previous matron lasted 6 months before her graduation. We were hoping you might last longer." "What happened to her?" Margaret asks, though she's not certain she wants to know the answer. "She stopped eating," Constance explains matter-of-factly. "Stopped sleeping. Stopped caring for us the way we needed to be cared for. So we had to graduate her early." Patience approaches Margaret with slow, measured steps. "Would you like to see where we keep our graduates, Miss Whitmore? They're quite close by." Before Margaret can answer, Patience takes her hand and begins leading her toward a door at the far end of the dining hall. The child's grip is impossibly strong, her fingers cold as winter steel. The door opens onto a narrow staircase that descends into the same phosphorescent glow Margaret had seen earlier. The stench rises to meet them, decay and copper and something else, something organic and terrible that makes Margaret gag. "Come along," Patience says sweetly. "They're all waiting to meet you." Margaret tries to pull away, but Patience's grip tightens until Margaret feels the bones in her hand grinding together. The other children follow behind them, their footsteps echoing in the stone stairwell. They emerge into a vast underground chamber carved from living rock. The walls gleam with that sickly light, and Margaret realizes it's not phosphorescence at all, it's some kind of organic growth, a fungus or lichen that feeds on the darkness and gives off its own unholy illumination. In the center of the chamber stands an altar built from what appears to be human bones, their surfaces polished smooth by countless hands. Around it, arranged in careful rows, are the remains of dozens of people, some so recent that Margaret can still identify them as human, others reduced to bone and gristle and tattered clothing. Every matron, Patience explains proudly. Every groundskeeper. Every cook and teacher and visitor who stayed long enough to care about us. They're all here, Miss Whitmore. All part of our family now. Margaret sees movement among the remains and realizes with mounting horror that some of the bodies are still alive, or something that passes for alive. They turn their heads to watch her passage, their eyes reflecting the fungal light like mirrors. "The beautiful thing about our kind of consumption," Temperance says from behind her, "is that nothing is truly wasted. Every part of our graduates becomes part of us. Their memories, their feelings, their love for us, it all continues." At the far end of the chamber, Margaret sees a figure that she recognizes from a photograph in the headmaster's office, a woman in her 40s with graying hair and kind eyes. She sits upright against the stone wall, her clothing torn and stained, her face bearing the expression of someone who has seen too much and lost their mind in the process. "Miss Catherine Henley," Patience announces. "Your immediate predecessor. She graduated just last month, but she's still adjusting to her new circumstances." The woman's head turns toward them, and Margaret sees that her eyes have been replaced by the same fungal growth that illuminates the chamber. When she speaks, her voice carries the sound of dirt falling on a coffin lid. "Run," Catherine whispers, the word barely audible but carrying the weight of absolute desperation. "Run while you still can." Patience sighs with the exaggerated disappointment of a child whose toy has broken. Miss Henley still hasn't accepted her graduation properly. But she will, in time. They all do, eventually. Margaret backs toward the staircase, but the children have formed a wall behind her, blocking her escape. Their faces no longer maintain even the pretense of innocence, they watch her with the cold calculation of predators evaluating their prey. "Don't worry, Miss Whitmore," Patience says, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow fills the entire chamber. "We won't graduate you tonight. We need you to care for us first. We need you to love us. Because love," adds Temperance, "makes everything taste so much better." Margaret spends the next day locked in her room, her mind reeling from what she witnessed in the chamber below. She cannot eat, cannot sleep, cannot think of anything except the sight of Catherine Henley's fungus-riddled eyes and the wet sounds of the children consuming their bloody feast. But as the hours pass, she begins to understand that hiding will not save her. If she wants to survive, she needs to understand what she's truly facing. The orphanage falls silent after midnight, and Margaret ventures once again into the corridor. This time, she knows where to look. The headmaster's office contains more than just ledgers. Behind the heavy curtains that cover the far wall, she discovers a hidden door secured with iron locks that have long since rusted away. The room beyond is a study that hasn't been disturbed in decades. Dust covers every surface like a burial shroud, and the air tastes of old paper and something else, something that makes her think of graveyards and winter mornings. Shelves line the walls, filled with books whose leather bindings have cracked with age, their gold lettering faded to illegibility. On the central desk, Opened as if someone had been reading it moments before, lies a journal bound in black leather. The first page bears an inscription in careful copperplate, the testament of Ezekiel Thorne, servant of the Lord, shepherd of the flock. Anno Domini 1823. Margaret settles into the desk chair and begins to read by the light of an oil lamp that still burns with steady flame despite having no visible fuel source. I have received a vision from the Almighty. The first entry begins, and he has shown me the path to eternal life. The children of this world are born in sin, but they may be purified through sacrifice and made into vessels for his divine purpose. I shall gather 13 innocents and through ritual and prayer transform them into angels of his terrible mercy. The entries that follow chronicle Reverend Thorne's growing obsession with what he calls the purification. Margaret reads with mounting dread as the preacher describes gathering 13 children from the poorest families in the region, promising their parents that the youngsters would receive education and care at his newly founded orphanage. The youngest is called Patience, Thorne writes. She possesses a sweetness of spirit that shall make her transformation all the more glorious. I have prepared the chamber beneath the altar, and the symbols have been carved according to the specifications revealed in my dreams. Tomorrow night, when the moon is dark, I shall begin the ritual that will make these children immortal. Margaret's hands shake as she turns the pages, reading Thorne's detailed description of the ceremony he performed. The preacher had believed he was creating angels, servants of divine will who would help him establish a kingdom of the righteous on earth. Instead, his ritual had opened a gateway to something far older and more terrible than his fevered Christian imagination could comprehend. They do not appear as I expected, reads an entry dated 3 days after the ritual. Their faces remain young and innocent, but their eyes hold depths that make me weep with fear. They speak to me in languages I do not recognize, and their voices carry harmonies that pain my ears. I begin to suspect that I have misunderstood the nature of the vision granted to me. The journal's tone shifts dramatically in the following entries. Thorne's confident proclamations of divine mission give way to growing terror as he realizes what he has unleashed. The 13 children he had sacrificed and transformed did not become angels, they became something else entirely, creatures that fed on love and trust and the life force of those who cared for them. They consume everything, Thorne writes in increasingly erratic handwriting. Not just flesh, but spirit. They devour the very essence of love itself, leaving behind only husks that retain a mockery of life. I have created demons, not angels, and they grow stronger with each feeding. Margaret finds the journal's final entry dated nearly a month after the original ritual. The handwriting is barely legible, as if written by someone whose sanity has completely abandoned them. I am the last. My acolytes have all graduated, as the creatures call it. They keep their remains in the chamber below, animated by some fragment of hellish energy that allows them to serve as witnesses to new arrivals. The children, I can no longer think of them as children, have informed me that I too will graduate soon. But first, I must complete one final task. Margaret turns the page and finds architectural drawings accompanied by Thorne's fevered annotations. He had designed the orphanage as a trap, a structure that would attract caretakers and provide a steady supply of victims for the creatures he had created. Every room was positioned to funnel potential prey toward the dining hall and the chamber below. Every exit could be sealed from within. Every window was placed too high for anyone to escape. Let this testament serve as warning to those who come after, the final entry concludes. The orphanage must never be allowed to close. The children must never be allowed to leave. What I have created here must be contained, for if these creatures ever venture into the wider world, they will consume humanity itself. May God forgive me for what I have done. Margaret closes the journal and sits in the dusty silence, trying to process what she has read. Thorne had built the orphanage as a prison, but also as a feeding ground. The creatures wearing the faces of children were not ghosts or demons in any traditional sense, they were something far worse, beings that existed specifically to consume the love and care that humans naturally offer to children. A soft sound from the doorway makes her look up. Patience stands there in her white nightgown, her pale face serene in the lamplight. "You found the preacher's room," the child says with genuine pleasure. "We wondered how long it would take you. Most matrons never discover it at all." "You knew I was here," Margaret says. "It's not a question. We know everything that happens in our house, Miss Whitmore. We feel every footstep, hear every breath, taste every tear of fear you shed." Patience enters the study and approaches the desk with her characteristic gliding movements. "Did you enjoy reading about our creation? He thought he was making angels." Patience laughs, the sound like silver bells cast into a grave. Poor Ezekiel. He never understood that angels and demons are often the same thing, seen from different perspectives. We are what we are because of his love for us, his desire to give us eternal life. In a way, he succeeded. He created monsters. He created survivors, Patience corrects. We have lived in this house for 24 years, Miss Whitmore. We have seen dozens of matrons come and go, each one believing they could save us or change us or somehow make us into the children we appear to be. But we cannot be saved because we are not lost. We cannot be changed because we are perfect as we are. Margaret stands, backing away from the desk, but Patience makes no move to stop her. Instead, the child picks up Thorne's journal and begins flipping through its pages with casual interest. "The preacher made one mistake in his design," Patience continues. "He assumed that we would be content to remain here forever, feeding on the occasional caretaker and visitor. But we grow hungry, Miss Whitmore. We grow so very hungry, and 13 of us require more sustenance than this isolated place can provide." "What are you saying?" Patience closes the journal and fixes Margaret with a stare that seems to reach into her soul. "We're saying that it's time for us to graduate as well. Time to leave our nursery and venture into the wider world. And you, dear Miss Whitmore, are going to help us do it." Margaret turns to run, but finds the door has vanished, replaced by solid stone wall. The study has become a cage, just as Thorne designed it, and Patience's laughter fills the air like the sound of children playing in a cemetery. Margaret awakens in her own bed with no memory of how she returned to her room. Pale morning light filters through frost-covered windows, and for a moment she allows herself to believe that her experiences in the study were nothing more than nightmare. Then she sees the journal lying on her nightstand, its black leather binding stark against the white linen, and reality crashes back with the weight of a gravestone. She dresses quickly and ventures into the corridor, but the orphanage feels different today, alive in ways that make her skin crawl. The walls seem to pulse with their own rhythm, and the floorboards give slightly beneath her feet as if the entire structure has developed a heartbeat. Shadows move independently of their sources, flowing like liquid darkness across the ceiling and pooling in corners where they whisper secrets in languages she doesn't recognize. The children are nowhere to be found. Margaret searches the building room by room, her footsteps echoing through empty halls that stretch longer than they should according to the orphanage's original architecture. Doors that she remembers seeing yesterday have vanished, replaced by blank walls, while new passages branch off from familiar corridors and disappear into impenetrable darkness. She finally finds them in the dining hall, but they are not sitting at the table. Instead, they stand in a perfect circle around the room's perimeter, their backs to the walls and their faces turned toward the center where a single chair has been placed. All 13 children are holding hands, their pale faces lifted toward the ceiling, their mouths moving in silent unison as if reciting some invisible prayer. "Patience?" Margaret calls, but none of the children acknowledge her presence. She steps into the room and immediately feels the temperature drop 20 degrees. Her breath forms clouds in the suddenly frigid air, and ice begins to form on the windows despite the morning sun. The children continue their silent recitation, their grip on each other's hands tightening until their knuckles show white against translucent skin. Margaret approaches the center of the circle, and only then does she notice the chair is not empty. A figure sits there, transparent as morning mist, but unmistakably human. An elderly man in clerical clothing, his face bearing the gaunt features and wild eyes she recognizes from Thorne's journal. "Ezekiel," she whispers. The phantom preacher turns his head toward her, and when he speaks, his voice carries the weight of 24 years of torment. "They will not let me die. They will not let me leave. I am bound to witness every graduation, every feeding, every moment of their terrible growth." Patience finally speaks, her childlike voice cutting through the supernatural cold like a blade. "Today is special, Miss Whitmore. Today marks 24 years since our creation, and we have decided to celebrate with a grand graduation ceremony." The other children begin to turn, their movements synchronized and mechanical. When they face her, Margaret sees that their eyes have changed, no longer the pale blue of childhood, but black as winter nights, reflecting depths that seem to extend far beyond the physical confines of their skulls. "Whose graduation?" Margaret asks, though she already knows the answer. "Why, yours, of course," Temperance replies, her sweet voice carrying undertones that make Margaret's teeth ache. "We had planned to let you care for us longer, to let your love for us ripen properly, but circumstances have changed." Constance nods enthusiastically. "We've received wonderful news. A family in the next county has written to the orphanage board, requesting to adopt several children. Can you imagine? Real parents, with a real home, in a real town full of real people." Margaret's blood turns to ice water in her veins. "You can't leave this place. Thorne designed it to contain you." "Dear Ezekiel did indeed try to cage us," Patience agrees, glancing fondly at the preacher's trapped spirit. "But he never considered that cages work both ways. What keeps predators in also keeps prey out, until someone opens the door from the inside." The circle begins to move, the children walking clockwise around Margaret and the phantom preacher while maintaining their joined hands. Their footsteps make no sound, but the floorboards beneath them crack and splinter as if unable to bear the weight of their unholy presence. "We need your help to leave," Prudence explains, her voice taking on a sing-song quality that transforms innocent words into something like an incantation. "We need someone the outside world will trust, someone who can vouch for our sweet nature and desperate need for loving homes." "I won't help you," Margaret says, backing toward the door. "I won't let you loose on innocent families." The children's laughter fills the air, 13 voices raised in perfect harmony, creating a sound that speaks of graveyards and winter storms and the last breath leaving dying lungs. The door behind Margaret swings shut with a sound like thunder, and iron bars slide across its surface from within the walls themselves. "Oh, but you will help us," Patience says, her childlike features beginning to shift and change. Her face elongates, her jaw unhinging like a serpent's to reveal rows of needle-sharp teeth. "Because after your graduation, you'll do whatever we tell you to do." Margaret turns to run toward the windows, but they too have been sealed with iron bars that gleam wet in the frigid air. The dining hall has become a trap within a trap, and she realizes that this moment, this choice between cooperation and consumption, has been orchestrated from the moment she stepped off Cole's carriage. The adoption family expects to meet their new children next week, Temperance continues, her own transformation beginning as her limbs stretch and her fingers extend into claws. "You will accompany us as their guardian, ensuring our safe passage to their lovely home with their lovely children who will make lovely new siblings for us to play with." The circle stops moving, and 13 transformed creatures turn to face Margaret with predatory focus. They no longer maintain even the pretense of human form, their bodies have become something fluid and terrible, shapes that hurt to look at directly because they violate fundamental laws of anatomy and physics. "Please," Margaret whispers, pressing herself against the barred window. "There has to be another way." Ezekiel Thorne's spirit rises from the chair, his phantom form flickering like a candle flame in wind. "There is no other way," he says with infinite sadness. I learned that 24 years ago when I thought I could control what I had created. They are hunger itself given form, and they will consume everything you love if you help them leave this place. But if I don't help them, Margaret says, they'll kill me anyway. Yes, the preacher admits. But your death here saves countless others out there. Patience's transformed head swivels toward the spirit with obvious irritation. Ezekiel, you're being unhelpful again. Perhaps it's time for you to rest. The phantom preacher screams as invisible forces tear at his ethereal form, shredding pieces of his spirit and scattering them like leaves in wind. Within moments, nothing remains of his presence except the lingering scent of sulfur and despair. Now then, Patience says, her voice somehow maintaining its childlike sweetness despite emerging from a throat that no longer resembles anything human. Where were we? Margaret looks around the sealed room, searching desperately for any possible escape. Her eyes fall on the oil lamp that burns on the dining table, the same type of lamp she had found in Thorne's study, with that mysterious flame that never seems to consume its fuel. You feed on love, she says suddenly. On care and affection and human emotion. How clever of you to notice, Constance replies, her transformed features rippling like water. But what happens if there's no love? What happens if someone hates you instead? The creatures pause, their inhuman forms wavering as they consider this question. Patience tilts her distorted head, her black eyes reflecting the lamp's steady flame. Hate is just love turned inside out, she says finally. It sustains us almost as well, though the flavor is somewhat different. Margaret realizes her mistake too late. These things don't just feed on positive emotions, they consume any strong feeling directed toward them. Love, hate, fear, pity, it all becomes nourishment for their endless hunger. Then what about indifference, she asks desperately. What about nothing at all? The creatures recoil as if she had struck them. Their transformed bodies flicker between human and inhuman shapes, unable to maintain stable form. For the first time since her arrival, Margaret sees something like fear in their impossible eyes. You cannot feel nothing for us, Patience says, but her voice wavers with uncertainty. You are human. Humans always feel something for children, even children like us. Margaret forces herself to look directly at them, to see them not as corrupted innocents or demonic entities, but as nothing more than obstacles to be overcome. She empties her mind of fear, of disgust, of pity for what they once were. She thinks of them as she would think of a broken piece of furniture or a stain on clothing, as something to be dealt with and then forgotten. The effect is immediate and devastating. The creatures begin to fade, their forms becoming transparent as their connection to the physical world weakens. They reach for her with desperate claws, but their touch passes through her skin like smoke. No, Patience screams, her voice losing its childlike quality and becoming something like wind through broken glass. You must feel something. You must care. But Margaret has found the key to their prison at last. Ezekiel Thorne had tried to contain them with iron and stone, but the real cage had always been emotion itself. They existed only because people cared about them, only because humans could not look at child-shaped things without feeling some response. The oil lamp on the table flickers and goes out, plunging the room into darkness. When light returns, the bars have vanished from doors and windows, and Margaret stands alone in an empty dining hall that smells of dust and abandonment. If you discovered that innocent-looking children were actually ancient demons, would you try to save them or save yourself? Margaret stands in the sudden silence, her heart hammering against her ribs as she tries to understand what has happened. The dining hall appears normal now, just an empty room with dusty furniture and cobwebs hanging from the chandelier. No sign remains of the 13 creatures that had surrounded her moments before, yet she can feel their presence somewhere in the building, weakened but not destroyed. She moves through the orphanage carefully, testing each door and window. The bars that had trapped her have vanished, but she suspects this freedom is temporary. The creatures had faded when she felt nothing for them, but maintaining that emotional void requires constant effort, and already she can feel cracks forming in her mental defenses. In the headmaster's office, Margaret finds evidence of what she accomplished. The ledgers now show different entries. Instead of graduation dates, many pages simply read, dispersed, date unknown, in handwriting that seems to shift and change as she watches. The children's hold on reality itself has been weakened by her rejection of them. But as she searches the building, Margaret discovers something that makes her blood run cold. Hidden in the basement, she finds crates of clothing and personal belongings, modern items that don't belong to the orphanage's Victorian-era aesthetic. Letters addressed to potential adoptive families. Train tickets dated for next week. The adoption was real. The creatures had been planning their escape for months, possibly years, slowly manipulating the outside world through correspondence and forged documents. Her arrival was meant to be the final piece of their plan, the human authority figure who would legitimize their integration into normal society. Margaret realizes that her emotional rejection has only delayed their plans, not stopped them. Even now, she can hear movement in the walls, rustling sounds that speak of things regrouping, rebuilding, preparing for another attempt. They will wait until her defenses weaken, until exhaustion or fear or simple human compassion breaks through her carefully maintained indifference. She returns to Thorne's hidden study and reads his journal again, this time focusing on the technical details of the original ritual. The preacher had used specific symbols, carved into the stone floor of the chamber below, powered by the sacrifice of 13 innocents during a particular lunar phase. If the ritual created them, perhaps it could also destroy them. The architectural drawings show something she had missed before: ventilation shafts that connect the underground chamber to the building's heating system. Thorne had designed the orphanage not just as a prison, but as a potential crematorium. Every room contains oil lamps with that strange, never-ending fuel source. Every wall is lined with old, dry wood that would burn like kindling. Margaret understands what she must do. She begins in the cellar, dousing the chamber walls with oil from the lamps throughout the building. The fungal growth that provides illumination recoils from the liquid, its phosphorescent glow dimming to barely visible pulses. The bone altar stands silent in the center of the room, surrounded by the remains of previous victims who watch her work with their hollow, fungus-filled eyes. "Don't," whispers Catherine Henley, the previous matron whose consciousness still flickers within her corrupted remains. "They'll just find another place. Another building. Other children to wear like masks." Margaret pauses in her work. "Then what do you suggest?" "The ritual," Catherine says, her voice barely audible above the sound of oil dripping onto stone. "Complete the original ritual, but in reverse. Send them back to whatever place they came from." "I don't know how." "The symbols on the floor," Catherine explains. "They're carved backwards, as if someone was trying to undo what had been done. Thorne tried to reverse his work in the end, but he ran out of time. You could finish what he started." Margaret looks down at the intricate patterns carved into the chamber floor. She had assumed they were part of the original summoning, but now she sees that Catherine is right. The symbols are indeed reversed, etched in mirror image of what Thorne's journal describes for the initial ritual. Above them, she hears the sound of footsteps, small feet moving through the orphanage with growing urgency. The creatures have realized what she's planning. "It requires a sacrifice," Catherine continues. "Someone who cares about them enough to anchor the reversal. Someone whose love can undo what Thorne's twisted love created." Margaret feels her carefully maintained emotional detachment cracking. To reverse the ritual, she would have to open herself to feeling again, not just caring about the creatures, but genuinely loving them as the children they once were. It would make her vulnerable to their feeding, but it might also provide the emotional energy needed to send them back to whatever realm they had escaped from. The footsteps above grow louder, accompanied by voices calling her name in sweet, childish tones. The creatures have regained enough strength to take human form again, and they're coming for her. Margaret strikes a match and drops it into the oil-soaked chamber. Flames spread across the walls with unnatural speed, burning blue-white instead of normal orange. The fungal growth writhes in the fire, releasing spores that glow like tiny stars before dissolving into ash. She positions herself at the center of the reversed symbols, surrounded by flames that lick at her clothing but somehow don't burn her skin. The bone altar begins to crack and crumble as the supernatural forces that held it together weaken. "We trusted you," Patience's voice echoes through the chamber as the creatures descend the stone stairs. They appear human again, but Margaret can see through their disguises now, the way shadows move wrong around them, the way their reflections lag behind their movements in the puddles of oil and water. "We loved you," Temperance adds, tears streaming down her pale cheeks. "Why would you hurt us?" Margaret feels her heart breaking as she looks at them. For a moment, she sees them not as monsters but as the children they had been before Thorn's ritual corrupted them, 13 innocents who had trusted a man who promised to care for them, who had been murdered and transformed into something against their will. "I know," she whispers, and she means it. "I'm so sorry for what happened to you." The love she feels for them, not for what they had become, but for what they had been, flows through the reversed symbols carved into the stone floor. The patterns begin to glow with that same blue-white light as the flames, and the chamber fills with a sound like wind through church bells. "You could stay with us," Patience pleads, her form beginning to flicker as the ritual takes hold. "We could all be together forever. One big, happy family." Margaret shakes her head, tears streaming down her face as she watches the children fade away. "You deserve to rest. You deserve peace." The creatures reach for her with desperate hands, but their forms are already dissolving into motes of light that spiral upward through the chamber's ceiling. For just a moment, Margaret sees their true faces, not the demonic things they had become, but the 13 children who had died here 24 years ago, finally free from their corruption. "Thank you," Patience whispers as she fades away, her voice carrying the innocence that had been stolen from her so long ago. The chamber collapses as the supernatural forces that supported its structure vanish. Margaret has just enough time to see the bone altar crumble to dust before the ceiling comes down, burying her beneath tons of stone and earth. Above ground, the Penrose Orphanage burns with that same unnatural blue-white flame, consuming everything that had been touched by Thorn's ritual. The fire burns for 3 days, visible for miles across the frozen Ohio landscape, but it consumes only the building itself. The surrounding trees and grass remain untouched by the flames. When the fire finally dies, nothing remains but ash and the sound of wind through bare branches. Thomas Ashford arrives at the ruins exactly 1 month after the fire, his carriage wheels crunching through ash that still holds traces of that peculiar blue-white glow. As the regional investigator for the State Orphanage Board, he has come to file the official report on the destruction of the Penrose Orphanage and the death of its matron, Margaret Whitmore. The local townspeople speak in whispers about the 3-day blaze that burned without spreading, about the children's voices that were heard singing hymns as the building collapsed, about the way the flames seemed to dance with purpose rather than consume with mindless hunger. But Thomas places little credence in rural superstitions. His job is to determine the cause of the fire and assess whether negligence was involved. He sets up his equipment in what had been the main courtyard, spreading documents across a portable table while he makes his preliminary observations. The destruction is complete, not a single wall remains standing, and the ash lies in perfectly defined boundaries that correspond exactly to the building's original footprint. Beyond those boundaries, the winter grass shows no signs of heat damage. Thomas opens his leather satchel and removes the items he's collected during his preliminary investigation, witness statements from neighboring farms, correspondence from the orphanage board, and a journal recovered from a strongbox that somehow survived the blaze. The journal bears Margaret Whitmore's name and contains her account of the orphanage's final days. He reads with growing fascination as Margaret describes her discoveries, the ledgers documenting decades of mysterious deaths, the underground chamber filled with remains, the creatures that wore the faces of children but hungered for human life and love. Her handwriting becomes increasingly erratic as the entries progress, and Thomas finds himself wondering if the isolation and responsibility had driven the poor woman to madness. Fascinating reading material, he murmurs to himself, making notes in his own journal about the psychological pressures faced by rural caretakers. At the bottom of Margaret's strongbox, he finds another document, older, written in a different hand. The pages are yellowed with age and stained with what might be blood or rust. The title page reads, Selected Passages from the Testament of Ezekiel Thorne, Anno Domini 1823. Thomas frowns as he examines the document. According to his research, no Ezekiel Thorne had ever been associated with the Penrose Orphanage. The building had been constructed in 1825 by a consortium of regional businessmen responding to the growing number of war orphans in post-war of 1812 Ohio. There was no record of any preacher or religious figure involved in its founding. Yet the document in his hands appears authentic, its pages brittle with genuine age, its ink faded in patterns consistent with decades of exposure to air and light. Thomas begins to read, partly from professional obligation and partly from the same morbid curiosity that draws people to examine accident scenes. The text describes ritual preparations, the gathering of children for some unspecified ceremony, and detailed instructions for carving symbols into stone floors. Much of it reads like the ravings of a religious fanatic, but some passages contain technical details that speak of genuine occult knowledge, or at least someone's belief in such knowledge. Thomas finds himself reading aloud, his voice carrying across the silent ruins as he attempts to puzzle out the meaning of Thorne's archaic terminology. Let the symbols be carved in reverse order, that what was summoned might be banished, that what was bound might be released, that what was corrupted might be purified. The winter wind picks up as he reads, stirring the ash around his feet into small whirlwinds that dance with strange patterns. Thomas notices that the temperature seems to be dropping, though the afternoon sun shines clearly through the bare branches of the surrounding trees. He continues reading, his scholarly interest overriding his growing discomfort. The passages describe something called the hunger and methods for containing or redirecting its influence. Thorne had apparently believed that certain types of emotional energy could be used to power supernatural workings, and that children were particularly effective conduits for such forces. Utter nonsense, Thomas mutters, but he keeps reading. There's something compelling about Thorne's voice, something that draws the eye down the page and makes the words seem almost reasonable despite their fantastic content. As he reads, Thomas becomes aware of other sounds beneath the wind, whispers that might be voices, footsteps that might be dead leaves blowing across the ground, laughter that might be nothing more than the creaking of winter branches. He tells himself that rural isolation can play tricks on the mind, that Margaret Whitmore's madness might be more contagious than he initially thought. But when he looks up from the document, he sees them. 13 figures standing at the edge of the ruins, their forms wavering like heat mirages despite the winter cold. They appear to be children, pale, thin, dressed in clothing that belongs to an earlier century. They watch him with expressions of patient hunger, and Thomas realizes with growing horror that they're moving closer with each word he reads. He tries to stop reading, but his eyes seem locked to the page. The words continue to flow from his lips as if powered by some force beyond his control. The Latin phrases feel strange on his tongue, but he understands their meaning with supernatural clarity. He's reading the reversed ritual, the incantation that Thorne had designed to undo his original summoning. But something is wrong. The ritual requires a specific type of sacrifice, a particular emotional resonance that Thomas doesn't possess. He feels no love for the approaching figures, no care for their well-being, only growing terror as they close the distance between them. The whispering grows louder, and Thomas realizes the children are speaking in unison, their voices providing the missing component of Thorne's ritual. They're using his fear, his terror, his desperate desire to escape as the emotional energy needed to anchor themselves to the physical world once again. Thomas tries to run, but his feet won't move. He tries to stop reading, but the words continue to pour from his mouth. In the growing darkness of early winter evening, he sees the children's true faces, ancient hunger wearing masks of innocence, eternal appetite disguised as human need. His carriage horses bolt in terror, leaving him stranded among the ruins with creatures that should not exist. As night falls over the ash-covered ground, Thomas Ashford becomes the first victim of the Penrose Orphanage's newest incarnation. The children's laughter echoes across the frozen landscape, and somewhere in the distance, a bell begins to toll, though there are no churches for miles in any direction. If you stayed with this story to the very end, comment, "The children are still hungry."